Imagine walking into a pharmacy in Europe around 400 years ago. The air smells of herbs, smoke, and vinegar. You are desperate, your head pounds relentlessly, or perhaps your child has terrible seizures. You hope for a cure, anything that will stop the suffering. The pharmacist, calm and professional, reaches behind a wooden counter and pulls out a small jar. Inside is not a familiar herb, not a soothing syrup, not even a simple powder of roots. Inside is powdered human skull. Yes, actual human skull ground into fine powder, ready to be ingested as medicine. You may want to stop here and assume this is a story about some remote village, some dark forest in a distant past. But no, this happened in the heart of Europe. Countries like Germany, Italy, France, and England were centers of medical cannibalism, and it was completely legal. Doctors, scholars, and even kings prescribed human remains as a standard treatment. Public executions weren't just a source of law enforcement, they were also a source of medicine. Fat, bones, and blood were harvested and sold in shops, and people willingly consumed them, believing they were healing. Most of us today associate cannibalism with horror movies or tales from distant lands. We think of tribes surviving by eating human flesh out of desperation. Europe doesn't usually come to mind. Yet from the 1400s until the late 1700s, Europeans regularly ate human body parts as medicine. It was taught in medical schools, defended in textbooks, and even practiced by royalty. Some scholars argue that this was the peak of scientific medicine in Europe at the time, because it was rationalized with logic, theory, and observation, but in hindsight it feels horrifying. To understand why people accepted this, we need to forget modern science for a moment. People didn't know about bacteria, germs, or how the body truly functioned. The foundations of European medicine were based on ancient Greek and Roman theories. Doctors studied Galen, Hippocrates, and Avicenna, and their work dominated medical education. One of the most influential ideas was the principle of like cures like. If you had a headache, something from the head might cure it. If you were bleeding internally, bone or powdered skull could stop it. Another critical idea was that of vital force. People believed that the human body carried energy, strength, and life itself. When someone died suddenly, especially a healthy young person, it was thought that their life energy was still strong. Consuming parts of that body transferred this energy to the sick person. Freshness mattered. Corpses that had been recently executed were considered far more potent than older ones. Religion also played a surprisingly large role in normalizing this practice. Christianity, the dominant religion in Europe, contained symbolic rituals involving flesh and blood. Communion, for example, involves eating bread and drinking wine as the body and blood of Christ. Additionally, the bones of saints were believed to hold miraculous powers, capable of healing the sick. When combined with medical theory, it was easy for people to believe that consuming parts of the human body could be beneficial rather than sinful. Doctors and priests often reassured patients that these treatments were moral, effective, and even sacred. Doctors genuinely believed they were helping people. This wasn't fringe behavior, it was mainstream. Medical cannibalism was discussed in medical textbooks, taught in universities, and practiced in hospitals. Prescriptions were carefully written for powdered skull, human fat, or blood, much like today's prescriptions for medicine. Executioners, too, were part of the process. After public executions, the bodies of criminals, especially those executed for serious crimes, were valuable resources. Fat was removed for ointments, skulls were powdered for pills, and blood could even be collected for direct consumption. And then there were the mummies. One of the strangest aspects of medical cannibalism is the use of ancient Egyptian mummies. For hundreds of years, Europeans believed that mummified bodies had powerful medicinal properties. Traders raided Graves in Egypt, crushed the bodies into powder, and shipped it to European pharmacies under the name mumia. Doctors prescribed mummy powder for everything from bleeding to infections to internal injuries. Some wealthy Europeans believed that only genuine ancient mummies could provide the best healing, paying large sums for them. When real mummies became scarce, Europeans began using recently deceased bodies, creating what they called artificial mummies from the corpses of the poor and executed. The consumption of human blood was another shocking example. People with epilepsy in particular were instructed to drink blood from freshly executed criminals. They would attend executions, sometimes collecting blood directly from the dying. Doctors believed that drinking blood restored the life force lost to the illness. It might feel gruesome today, but for them, it was a logical, medically approved solution. Human fat was also popular. removed from the bodies of executed criminals, it was rendered into ointments and pills to treat pain, injuries, and arthritis. Executioners often profited from selling fat, making executions not only a public spectacle, but also an economic enterprise. Interestingly, this practice wasn't limited to the lower classes. Doctors, scholars, and royalty were heavily involved. King Charles II of England reportedly drank a mixture containing powdered human skull. European nobles competed for the best human medicine. Executioners and pharmacists often sold the remains of criminals to the wealthy for considerable sums. In universities, students were taught how to prepare human-based medicines, learning recipes that included dried skull, human fat, and blood. In essence, consuming human bodies was both a medical and social phenomenon, deeply integrated into European culture. At the same time, European explorers were traveling the world and writing about the customs of Africa, the Americas, and the Pacific Islands. Many accounts accused local peoples of cannibalism, often exaggerating or fabricating details to justify slavery, colonization, or conquest. Meanwhile, Europeans were practicing their own cannibalism openly, legally, and in the name of medicine. The double standard is striking. European society considered itself civilized, yet it openly consumed human flesh. Other cultures were labeled savage for the very behavior that was normalized in Europe. Medical cannibalism continued for centuries because it fit into the social, religious, and medical logic of the time. It wasn't seen as shocking, it was rational, it was moral. People believed in the life-giving power of human bodies. They trusted doctors and clergy who prescribed and sanctioned these treatments. Public executions, far from being purely punitive, were also medical events, providing bodies for a growing, profitable trade in human remains. Even in retrospect, it's hard to grasp. Imagine a pharmacy where the shelves are filled with jars labeled human skull powder for epilepsy, fat of the condemned for pain relief, or mummy powder for internal bleeding. The smell of vinegar and herbs mixes with something unspoken, the weight of death, the extraction of human life for profit and health. And yet people walked in, paid for the medicine, and believed it would save them or their children. Medical cannibalism reveals something critical about human history. Belief and authority can make even the most shocking ideas seem normal. For centuries, people were convinced that consuming human bodies was not only acceptable, but necessary. This was a society that considered itself advanced, rational, and civilized, yet one of its most common medical practices was eating other humans. And here's one of the most unsettling lessons. Much of the population that suffered or died from these treatments belonged to people with no power or voice. The executed criminals, the poor, and the unclaimed dead were transformed into medicine without consent. It highlights a recurring theme in history: power determines morality. Those in power, kings, doctors, scholars, defined what was right and wrong, often to their benefit. By the end of the 17th century, this practice had permeated nearly every level of European society. It was medical, economic, social, and symbolic. It shows how ideas, even horrifying ones, can be normalized when supported by authority, culture, and belief. As we move deeper into this story, it's hard not to pause and reflect. What kind of world accepts powdered human skull as medicine? Yet in 16th and 17th century Europe, this was not only accepted, it was celebrated as cutting-edge science. One of the most fascinating and disturbing examples is the use of mummies in medicine. Europeans of the time believed that ancient Egyptian mummies had magical healing properties. Long before modern archaeology existed, Europeans were buying, selling, and consuming human remains shipped across continents. Traders raided Egyptian tombs, stole the mummified bodies of pharaohs, nobles, and commoners alike, and transporting them back to Europe. Once there, the dried, preserved bodies were crushed into fine powder, packaged in ornate jars, and sold as medicine. This powder, called mumia, was believed to stop bleeding, treat infections, and heal internal injuries. Some European doctors insisted that only the truly ancient mummies could cure certain ailments. The newer the body, the weaker its power. It wasn't just a matter of exotic taste. Mummies were considered precious medicine, akin to gold or rare spices. Wealthy Europeans paid exorbitant sums for mummy powder, often believing that the more expensive the powder, the more potent it would be. Apothecaries competed to offer the best stock, sometimes claiming their mummies had been preserved in perfect conditions, with histories dating back centuries. And when real Egyptian mummies ran out, which unsurprisingly they eventually did, Europeans did something shocking. they created artificial mummies. These were made from recently deceased Europeans, usually executed criminals or the poor, and sold as substitutes for the rare ancient powder. Here's a chilling anecdote. In some European cities, the market for human-based medicines became so organized that executioners would sell parts of the dead body immediately after execution. Fat, considered especially valuable for ointments, was carefully removed, weighed, and sold to apothecaries. Skulls were ground into powder, packaged, and marketed with instructions on how to use them for headaches, epilepsy, and mental illness. Blood was collected, sometimes from prisoners in the moments before death, and sold as a tonic believed to restore strength and vitality. Even in hospitals, human remains were not taboo. Apothecaries displayed jars labeled crushed human skull for migraine or fat of the condemned for pain relief. Patients, including nobles, trusted doctors who prescribed these remedies. And yes, these were highly respected doctors, trained in universities and considered experts. They did not see themselves as practicing barbarism. They were performing the pinnacle of medical science as it was understood at the time. One of the most famous consumers of human-based medicine was King Charles II of England. Historical accounts suggest that he drank a mixture containing powdered human skull, believing it would preserve his youth and health. He was far from alone. European aristocrats, including princes and high-ranking nobles, actively sought the finest human-based medicines. Executioners and pharmacists capitalized on this demand. There was even a hierarchy of human body parts. The younger the person, the more potent the remedy. Executed criminals were preferred, and bodies that had died suddenly were prized for their preserved life force. Doctors of the time wrote detailed instructions on how to prepare and administer these treatments. One 17th century manual, for example, included a recipe for a healing ointment made from human fat, wine, and herbs. It claimed that rubbing this mixture on painful joints or open wounds would bring relief. Other texts described how to grind skulls into fine powder and mix them with honey or alcohol to treat internal bleeding or epilepsy. These manuals were not obscure, they were widely circulated and considered authoritative. The logic behind these practices makes sense when viewed through the lens of contemporary beliefs. The idea of like cures like, a head cures a head, blood cures blood, was central. The body was thought to contain a life force that could be transferred. Eating the flesh or drinking the blood of a healthy, young, or recently deceased person was believed to transfer vitality and strength to the sick. And religiously, consuming human bodies did not seem immoral. The Church's rituals already normalized symbolic ingestion of flesh and blood, as in the Eucharist. The bones of saints were considered healing. If sacred bones could heal, why not the body of an executed criminal? Perhaps the most shocking treatment involved drinking fresh human blood. People with epilepsy or anemia were sometimes instructed to attend public executions, where they would collect blood directly from the dying. The idea was that fresh, warm blood was alive with energy, capable of restoring the body's lost vitality. While it may sound horrifying today, at the time it was perfectly rational, recommended by educated physicians, and practiced openly. Fat was equally popular. Extracted from executed criminals, human fat was turned into ointments, salves, and pills. Wealthy clients sought the best quality fat, believing it cured arthritis, healed wounds faster, and restored energy. Apothecaries often advertised these remedies, sometimes including testimonials from satisfied patients. One account describes a woman who used fat-based ointments from executed criminals to ease chronic pain. In her letters, she praised the results and encouraged friends to try it. Medical cannibalism was not limited to a few countries, it was pan-European. Italy, Germany, France, and England all had thriving markets in human-based medicine. Public executions provided a steady supply of bodies, and wealthy buyers ensured that demand remained high. Some cities even passed local laws to regulate the sale of body parts, ensuring that only certain types could be sold, and that certain methods of preparation were followed. At the same time, Europe was exploring the world. European writers, merchants, and explorers described distant lands and peoples as barbaric, often accusing them of cannibalism. These stories were used to justify colonization, slavery, and conquest. Meanwhile, Europeans themselves were practicing cannibalism openly, legally, and in the name of medicine. The hypocrisy is staggering. What was medicine at home was savagery elsewhere. Perhaps the most fascinating aspect is the human psychology behind this. Doctors, apothecaries, and patients truly believed in the efficacy of these remedies. It wasn't cruelty, it was conviction. They thought they were saving lives. In some ways, it's a cautionary tale about the dangers of authority combined with unquestioned belief. People were willing to consume human remains because they trusted the experts, trusted the system, and believed the world was rationally ordered. As medical cannibalism became entrenched, the practice even influenced literature, art, and culture. Satirical pamphlets mocked it, warning of overzealous doctors who prescribed skull powder for minor ailments. In some cities, street vendors sold human-based remedies alongside traditional herbs and spices, blurring the lines between medicine and commerce. It became a symbol of both innovation and excess, a window into the complex social and economic networks of early modern Europe. Interestingly, not everyone agreed with medical cannibalism. Some religious leaders questioned the morality of using human remains. Some physicians began to experiment with alternatives, using herbs or chemical compounds instead. But these voices were often drowned out by centuries of tradition and the sheer profitability of the human medicine trade. Apothecaries and executioners had a vested interest in maintaining supply and demand, while patients, desperate for cures, reinforced the practice simply by believing it worked. Over time, medical cannibalism started to decline, but not immediately. As late as the 18th century, doctors were still prescribing skull powder for headaches, fat-based ointments for arthritis, and mummy powder for bleeding. Its decline came with the rise of modern science. New discoveries in anatomy, chemistry, and eventually germ theory exposed the inefficacy of these treatments. Human remains were no longer necessary for healing, and gradually the trade disappeared from pharmacies. Yet even as it faded, the legacy of medical cannibalism remained. It serves as a reminder that civilization and morality are not guaranteed by wealth, knowledge, or status. It challenges the notion that European history is a straightforward story of progress. For centuries, even educated, wealthy, and religious people participated in practices that today seem shocking, barbaric, or unimaginable. Medical cannibalism also forces us to confront difficult questions about power and ethics. Whose bodies were used? Who profited? Who got to decide what was moral? The poor, the executed, and the marginalized were turned into commodities for the health of the wealthy. Public executions, which might have been intended to demonstrate justice, were simultaneously feeding the medical system and the economy. As you reflect on this, it's worth asking, how often do we accept practices today simply because they are endorsed by experts, tradition, or authority? What beliefs in our society might future generations look back on with disbelief, just as we now look at powdered skulls and mummy medicine? Medical cannibalism is not just a story of horror, it's a story of human belief, desperation, and ingenuity. It's about a world where science, religion, and commerce intersected in ways that created practices that seem impossible to imagine today. And yet, for hundreds of years, this was normal. This was rational. This was medicine. As we move further into this story, it's impossible not to marvel at the sheer scale and organization of medical cannibalism in Europe. By the 17th and early 18th centuries, it had become not only a medical practice but also a business, a social phenomenon, and, strangely, a cultural norm. It's easy for us today to shake our heads in disbelief, but to the people of that time, this was logic, science, and even morality in action. Consider, for a moment, a wealthy European family in Paris or London around 1650. A child falls ill. The family calls their doctor. The doctor prescribes powdered human skull for the child's seizures and human fat for the fever and pains that come with the illness. Perhaps a drop of human blood is mixed with wine to restore vitality. The family trusts the doctor, trusts the tradition, and dutifully administers the medicine. Meanwhile, apothecaries are busy selling jars of skull powder, bottles of blood, and packages of fat. Executioners, whose role society already feared and respected, are now essential suppliers to the medical system. This was a world where public executions were simultaneously legal punishment, public spectacle, and medical supply chain. The bodies of criminals were no longer just instruments of justice, they were raw materials. Fat was rendered into ointments, bones were ground into powder, blood was collected while still warm. Each part of the body had its purpose, and the social hierarchy dictated whose body was available. Executed criminals, the poor, and the marginalized were the primary sources, while the wealthy paid for their health with what was taken from the powerless. Medical cannibalism was also socially stratified. Not everyone could access high-quality human medicine. Only the wealthy could afford skulls from recently executed criminals or fat collected from prime specimens. The middle and lower classes sometimes had to make do with older or lower quality materials, while the poor often had no access at all. In some cities, laws even regulated the sale of human-based medicines to ensure quality and proper handling. Apothecaries became specialists in processing these substances, and some became quite wealthy, selling both herbs and human-based remedies. The role of religion is particularly fascinating. On the one hand, the Church officially condemned murder and desecration of bodies. On the other hand, it sanctioned or tolerated the use of executed criminals for medical purposes. Why? Because it framed the practice as morally acceptable if it benefited the living, and if the bodies used were already condemned or dead. Saints, relics, symbolic communion, and centuries of religious tradition created an environment where consuming human parts could be viewed as not sinful, but healing. People trusted priests and doctors alike to guide them in moral and medical matters, creating a system where cannibalism became normalized. One of the most striking anecdotes involves apothecaries advertising their products publicly. Street vendors and shopkeepers would display jars labeled powder of the condemned or fat of the executed, effective for joint pain. Some included testimonials. After rubbing the fat of an executed man upon my legs, I could walk without pain for the first time in months. Families wrote letters praising the effects of skull powder for migraines or epilepsy. People who experienced positive results often became lifelong believers, reinforcing the system through word of mouth. It wasn't only commoners who relied on these remedies. Nobility and royalty actively participated. King Charles II of England, for instance, reportedly consumed powdered skull to maintain vitality and youth. Noble households often employed private apothecaries who sourced the best human-based medicines for the family. Executioners sold these substances at premium prices, sometimes documenting which criminals' bodies produced the most potent medicine. The combination of wealth, desperation, and belief made medical cannibalism a thriving, profitable enterprise. Yet alongside this widespread practice, there were voices of skepticism and critique. Some physicians began questioning the morality and efficacy of consuming human bodies. Religious leaders occasionally expressed concern over the desecration of corpses. Satirical pamphlets mocked doctors who prescribed skull powder for minor ailments, highlighting the absurdity and excess of the practice. For example, one pamphlet joked about a doctor who recommended the skull of a recently hanged man for a mild headache, asking if the same doctor would recommend the entire skeleton for a hangnail. These critiques, however, were minor compared to the weight of centuries of tradition, economic incentives, and social trust in medical authorities. The psychology behind this is fascinating. Humans have a remarkable ability to normalize practices that would otherwise seem abhorrent if they are framed as authoritative, beneficial, or traditional. Medical cannibalism thrived because society trusted doctors, believed in the theory of like cures like, and accepted the idea of vital energy in the human body. People were desperate to heal themselves or their loved ones, and in that desperation, even the most shocking remedies seemed logical. Another remarkable aspect is how European explorers and colonial narratives intersected with medical cannibalism. While Europe consumed human bodies openly, explorers were describing distant peoples as savage and barbaric, often accusing them of cannibalism. These accounts were exaggerated or fabricated to justify colonization and the transatlantic slave trade. Meanwhile, in Europe, consuming human bodies for medicine was legal, respected, and defended by doctors. The contradiction is stark and uncomfortable, illustrating a persistent theme in history. Power shapes morality. What those in power do is considered legitimate, what the powerless are accused of is condemned. The decline of medical cannibalism did not occur suddenly. As scientific methods began to take hold, European thinkers started challenging old beliefs. Advances in anatomy revealed the complexity of the human body in ways that did not support the idea that consuming bones or blood could heal. Chemistry allowed for the creation of alternative medicines. Observation and experimentation began to replace tradition and authority as the primary source of knowledge. Moral attitudes also began to shift. The growing Enlightenment emphasis on human dignity and rationality made the casual consumption of human bodies increasingly troubling. Gradually, public opinion and medical practice changed. By the late 18th century, human-based remedies were falling out of favor. Apothecaries removed powdered skulls and human fat from their shelves. Executioners no longer sold bodies as medical supplies. And for the first time in centuries, Europe began to treat the dead with greater respect, moving away from centuries-old practices that blurred the line between medicine, commerce, and morality. The decline of medical cannibalism also highlights the relationship between efficacy and morality. Once it became clear that eating human remains had no real medical benefit, the practice was abandoned, not necessarily because it was unethical, but because it didn't work. Science replaced superstition, evidence replaced tradition, and for the first time, medicine began to resemble the rational system we recognize today. Yet even as it faded, the legacy of medical cannibalism remained. It offers powerful lessons about the human capacity for belief, the social construction of morality, and the ways in which power shapes what is accepted and what is condemned. It reminds us that civilization is never a straight line, and even societies that consider themselves advanced can participate in practices that seem shocking to later generations. Medical cannibalism also challenges our understanding of progress. Europe often presents itself as the birthplace of modern science, ethics, and civilization, and indeed, scientific and cultural achievements were real. But the history of consuming human bodies for medicine shows that knowledge and morality do not always advance together. People can be intelligent, educated, and religiously devout while still participating in practices we now view as barbaric. It also forces us to reflect on the ethics of medicine today. How often do we trust authority, tradition, or expert opinion without questioning it? What treatments are accepted now that might seem unimaginable in the future? Medical cannibalism is a vivid reminder that belief, desperation, and authority can combine to normalize practices that would otherwise be unthinkable. By the 18th century, the narrative was changing. Physicians were beginning to study the body systematically. They experimented with herbs, minerals, and chemical compounds that had actual effects on illness. Human-based medicine was no longer necessary. Societies began to reconsider the morality of using corpses for profit or health. Executioners' dual role as punishers and suppliers faded. Public executions remained, but the trade in human body parts declined and eventually disappeared. Despite this decline, Europe's history of medical cannibalism lingers in the shadows. Few textbooks discuss it, few museums showcase it, and yet it profoundly shaped European medicine, commerce, and society for centuries. Understanding this history forces us to confront uncomfortable truths. Intelligence, wealth, and status do not guarantee morality. Cultural beliefs, desperation, and economic incentives can normalize practices that today seem abhorrent. Ultimately, medical cannibalism was a reflection of its time. It reveals a Europe where science, religion, and commerce intersected in ways that allowed human bodies to become commodities, where belief in life force and like cures overrode common sense, and where the powerful could dictate what was moral and what was acceptable. It's a story that shocks, fascinates, and challenges the way we think about history, medicine, and human nature. As we reach the final chapter of this story, it's important to reflect not only on what happened, but also on what it tells us about humanity. Medical cannibalism may feel like a tale from a distant, unimaginable past, but it is, in many ways, a story about human belief, desperation, and the complex interaction of power and morality. The European obsession with human-based medicine persisted for centuries because it was supported by tradition, authority, and an entire social system built around it. By the late 18th century, Europe was beginning to change. The Enlightenment had begun to sweep through cities and universities, promoting reason, observation, and critical thinking. Doctors started to question old medical practices and demand evidence for treatments. Anatomy classes became more systematic, with cadavers studied to understand the workings of the human body, not to grind into medicine. Chemistry and pharmacology developed, providing real, observable remedies that could replace superstition. Gradually, human-based medicines disappeared from pharmacies. Apothecaries stopped selling powdered skulls and human fat, and executioners no longer profited from the bodies of the condemned in the same way. Yet the decline was gradual, not immediate. Even as the new sciences emerged, centuries-old traditions lingered. Some doctors continued to prescribe human-based remedies, and some patients still believed in their power. Letters and diaries from the 1700s describe people secretly mixing skull powder with other treatments, convinced that it worked when nothing else did. It is a testament to the power of belief, how a practice can survive even in the face of rational evidence if it has been trusted for generations. One of the most fascinating aspects of this history is how deeply it intersects with morality, power, and inequality. Who became medicine? The executed criminals, the poor, the marginalized, and the powerless. Who consumed it? Wealthy nobles, kings, and patients who could afford apothecaries' services. The system was highly stratified. The powerful could use human bodies to improve their health and extend their lives, while the powerless were used as raw material without consent. In other words, medical cannibalism was a literal example of how power and wealth dictated morality in early modern Europe. At the same time, European explorers were traveling the globe, documenting practices in Africa, the Americas, and the Pacific Islands. Many of these accounts accused indigenous peoples of cannibalism, often exaggerating or fabricating details to justify colonization, slavery, or conquest. Meanwhile, in Europe itself, cannibalism was legal, socially accepted, and even praised when conducted in the name of medicine. The contradiction is stark. What was considered barbaric elsewhere was normalized at home. This hypocrisy exposes a central lesson of history. Morality is often defined by those in power, and what is labeled acceptable or unacceptable can depend entirely on perspective. Beyond social hierarchy, medical cannibalism offers insight into human psychology. Humans have an extraordinary capacity to normalize the abnormal when it is sanctioned by authority, tradition, and culture. People trusted doctors, clergy, and texts. They believed in the theory of like cures like, and in the transfer of vital energy. Families, desperate to heal loved ones, willingly consumed human remains. Even when confronted with gruesome realities, the promise of healing made it seem rational. This reminds us that even intelligent, educated, and religious people are capable of participating in practices that, from a modern perspective, are shocking or horrifying. Medical cannibalism also highlights the complex interplay between science and morality. For centuries, European doctors were respected and trusted, yet many prescribed remedies that had no real medical benefit. Their knowledge and expertise were unquestioned, even when their practices involved consuming human bodies. It took the rise of empirical observation, experimentation, and the scientific method to finally expose the inefficacy of human-based medicine. In other words, morality sometimes lags behind knowledge, and accepted practice does not always equate to ethical practice. Yet even in decline, medical cannibalism left a profound mark on European culture. It influenced literature, pamphlets, and public discourse. Satirical texts mocked overzealous doctors, describing families who ingested skull powder for trivial ailments or blood for minor fevers. Art and literature of the time reflected the tensions between tradition and modernity, science and superstition. The practice also shaped the early pharmaceutical industry, creating a system of commerce, regulation, and expertise around medicine that would eventually evolve into modern pharmacies and hospitals. As we look at the larger picture, medical cannibalism is not just a historical curiosity, it's a lesson in humility and skepticism. It reminds us that no society is immune to irrationality, no matter how advanced or educated it may appear. Knowledge can be flawed, and morality can be malleable, especially when power, wealth, and desperation intersect. We may look back and shudder, but centuries later, future generations may look at some of our accepted practices and feel the same disbelief. This history also invites reflection on ethics and consent. The bodies used in these remedies belonged almost exclusively to the powerless, criminals, the poor, and the marginalized. No one asked for their consent. No one considered their dignity. In the pursuit of health and profit, human lives were commodified. Today, we have ethical standards, laws, and medical codes to protect the rights of patients and research subjects. Yet this history reminds us that these protections are recent and hard-won. They exist precisely because practices like medical cannibalism once seemed acceptable. Medical cannibalism also challenges the idea of European exceptionalism. Europe is often taught as the cradle of modern science, reason, and civilization. While the continent did indeed produce remarkable achievements in philosophy, art, and medicine, this history shows that progress is rarely linear. Civilization and morality do not always advance together. For centuries, Europe was both enlightened and grotesque, sophisticated and barbaric, rational and deeply irrational, all at the same time. Ultimately, medical cannibalism serves as a mirror, reflecting human tendencies across time. It asks uncomfortable questions. How far will people go in the name of health, science, or progress? How often do we accept authority without questioning it? How do power, wealth, and desperation shape what we consider right or wrong? These questions are just as relevant today as they were in the 17th century. By the end of the 18th century, medical cannibalism quietly disappeared. Apothecaries removed human-based remedies from shelves. Executioners no longer supplied fat, bones, or blood for medicine. New scientific methods and empirical observation replaced centuries of belief in the power of human remains. And yet, despite its disappearance, the legacy of medical cannibalism continues to fascinate, shock, and educate us. It remains a powerful reminder of the dangers of unquestioned authority, the role of culture in shaping belief, and the sometimes dark intersection of science, commerce, and morality. In conclusion, medical cannibalism is not just a story of horror, it is a story of humanity. It is a story of people trying to heal loved ones, of doctors doing what they thought was right, of societies creating rules and norms that seem unimaginable today. It reminds us that history is rarely clean or simple. It is messy, paradoxical, and often deeply human. And above all, it reminds us to approach the past and the present with humility, curiosity, and a willingness to question even the most trusted authorities. Next time someone describes Europe as purely civilized or enlightened, remember this story. Remember the powdered skulls, the mummy powder, the blood and fat sold as medicine. Remember that once upon a time, European doctors, scholars, and kings believed that the cure for illness could be found not in herbs or chemistry, but in the bodies of other humans. This history, though shocking, is not meant to condemn. It is meant to illuminate. It is meant to teach us that morality, knowledge, and human behavior are deeply intertwined, and that every society, no matter how advanced it seems, has moments that challenge our sense of right and wrong. Medical cannibalism is one of those moments, a window into the past that both fascinates and warns, revealing the complexities of humanity in a way that no textbook or statistic ever could.